Hello, everybody. My name is Tom Romanoff. I am the Director of Policy for the Association for Computing Machinery. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to host this panel on the Union's digital omnibus efforts and what their impacts will be in terms of the technology. There's been a lot of discussion on simplification versus the drawbacks of or costs essentially of simplifying these things and what would be the trade-offs there. So I'm very happy to have a host of people to talk about it. And with no further ado, I'll kick it over to Michelle to get us started.
Well, thank you, Tom. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar organized by the ACM Europe Technology Policy Committee. I'm the professor of computer science in the University Paris-Saclay in France, but I'm here as chair of this ACM Technology Policy Committee for Europe. For those of you who don't know, ACM is a worldwide organization, the largest the learned society in computing. And one of its activities is to, in an apolitical and non-lobbying way, educate and inform decision makers about potential impacts of technology policy, digital technology for the most part, impacts that can be, of course, positive or negative. So just so you know, the ACM technology policy is organized with the Global Council. Tom Romanoff here is the Global Tech Policy Director for ACM. Then we have an ACM Europe committee, and this committee has several subcommittees on different topics. And on our panel today, we have several members of these subcommittees who have contributed to answering the European Commission consultation on the digital omnibus, and also a person, I would say, from the outside, who will also be able to comment and discuss the issue. So, what is a digital omnibus? It's a set of proposed regulations and amendments to existing European regulation to do various things that we'll be discussing if they actually achieve those goals of simplifying things and maybe making Europe more competitive. It contains a lot of different aspects. And so, as often with the European Union Commission, there's a way for anybody to comment on their proposals. And ACM Europe TPC, as we call it for short, Technology Policy Committee, has answered this consultation. So what we're going to discuss today is different aspects of this digital omnibus. Not all of them. We can cover everything in 1 hour. I want to welcome our panelists today. I will take them in the order that they are on my screen, and I assume on yours as well. So we have Hamid Naji from Belgium. I will let them introduce themselves more thoroughly in a second. Stephanie Housden from the UK, Maciej Zuziak from Italy, and Zach Myers from Belgium as well. And so just to get started, I would like to each give you the floor for a short introduction. So let's start in the same order with you, Hamid.
Good afternoon, everybody. A pleasure to be here. I'm Ahmed Nagy. I work as a policy technology advisor in the Belgian Nuclear Research Center, mainly the coordinator of the artificial intelligence working the group there, and also a principal engineer. It's a pleasure to be here, and I believe it's a timely talk about Omnibus with all the challenges to integrate and include the different requirements in order to run high-stake systems and integrate AI in them. It's very necessary to make sure that this is done properly in governance that is possible to audit and comply. I give back the floor to you. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Uh, okay, what about you, Stephanie?
Hello, I'm Steph, and I've spent around 20 years as a software engineer and technical lead. I've worked across startups, large technology organizations, as well as regulated environments. I'm speaking here today in a personal capacity based on my experience. So across my roles, a lot of my work has been at the crossover of delivery and governance. And what really stands out to me about the digital omnibus is the balance it's trying to strike between enabling innovation and maintaining safety and trust. So I'm particularly interested in how simplification efforts land in reality and whether they will genuinely reduce the complexity for teams or whether, it might cause some ambiguity. So back to you, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you. Maciej, up to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Maciej Zuziak, and I'm working at the right now University of Leeds in UK, and previously in Italy in the Italian Research Council. And I'm dealing with machine learning and privacy, and hopefully I'll be able to introduce a little bit like privacy issues that pop up in the digital omnibus because there is a lot of going on there, and Commission is struggling hard to relax the environment for businesses on one side, and on the other side, protect the fundamental rights. So I think that it will be quite enjoyable talk today, and thank you very much for coming.
Okay, thank you. Zach?
Hi, thanks for having me, Michelle, Tom. I'm Zach Myers, Director of Research at CER, the Center on Regulation in Europe. We are an independent think tank based in Brussels that focuses on digital, energy, and telecoms regulation across Europe. And so I've been very interested in following this debate around competitiveness and its relationship with tech sovereignty and with consumer protection and maintaining Europe's regulatory standards. So the omnibus is kind of a strange creature, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that raises a lot of interesting questions around the intersection of those three things. So thanks for having me as the kind of outside voice, as it were.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, so the digital omnibus. So as I'm sure most of the people on the call know, Europe has been very active at trying to regulate the digital space. We all know about the GDPR, which has been used sort of as a model worldwide of protecting personal data. We've heard more recently about the AI Act, which is using this sort of the risk-based approach to try to give different rules depending on the risk raised by the specific application of AI that you're doing. There's also regulation on cybersecurity. And so my take on the omnibus is that on the one hand, it's true that these different regulations have sort of piled on top of each other in with sort of interactions with each other. For example, when you train an AI model, you may want to use you need to use data, and you may want to use personal data. So how does it square with GDPR? To just this one example. And so clearly, there was a feeling in the commission that we need to sort of clarify a little bit all that. We also know that people find that there are too many rules, and that applies to European companies, for example, who are pushing for simplification and in the name of better competitiveness with companies outside of Europe. And also, to be honest, there was also clearly pressure from outside countries and the new administration in the US, who has, as you know, threatened to limit access to what their companies are doing if the EU was not making it a little bit easier. And so I think behind this omnibus, my take is that there are different factors at play. Now, the important point from our perspective as ACM Tech Policy is how are these changes affecting, well, we mentioned fundamental rights, how they're affecting competitivity or competitiveness, how they're affecting the global picture for US citizens and for Europe on the international scene. And so I'm going to start with you, Zach, to get your take on why has the Commission chosen this omnibus approach, and is it about simplification? Is it about deregulation, like some people pretend? And yeah, what's your take on this?
Thank you. I think it's interesting to maybe go back, maybe to around like the early 2020s when the first von der Leyen Commission passed, I think, about 116 laws that were affecting the tech sector. And so there had been a growing concern in, a lot of the EU that uh, the number of tech laws that were being passed was kind of too fast, and the interrelationships between them weren't always fully thought out. They didn't all have time to get implemented properly before the next layer of regulation was added. And so this really culminated in these reports that two Italian prime ministers published, Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi, on European competitiveness and the single market. And both of those reports were quite critical about the complexity and in some cases the kind of risk tolerance of European regulation. And kind of what they kind of proposed was a two-step process where you would have the kind of quick fixes progress quite quickly, things that were kind of no-brainers, simplifications that didn't really affect regulatory standards or risk tolerance. And then at the same time, you'd have a longer process that would think about the more politically contentious ways of addressing regulatory burdens. And so you can kind of think about the omnibus proposals as this kind of quick fix idea. And I think in that context, it's been quite interesting that actually, some of these omnibus proposals are quite controversial and they haven't been received by MEPs and by member states in the way that maybe the Commission thought that they might. But basically, the point was to address some problems quickly. And at the same time, there is this what's called a digital fitness check, which is a review of the entire digital rulebook and might propose some more ambitious changes. But so as to your question as to whether the omnibus is simplification or deregulation, I think the idea was that it would be simplification and not deregulation. I think when you look into some of the detail, you see that the line between the two of those is blurred and not quite so easy to delineate in every case. There's some things that make complete sense, merging a lot of the different data laws into one. Consolidating kind of cybersecurity and data protection reporting methods is another. These seem to be relatively uncontroversial. But then you look at others like revisiting the definition of personal data under GDPR, and this is moving from an approach that was, currently focused on whether data can be re-identified using information that the data processor may not have, to a more subjective approach where it's based on, looking at the data by itself. Can the person who holds it possibly identify a person? And so if you move to that second approach, obviously you're making a lot more data fall outside the scope of GDPR, but you are also raising some risks that data might be re-identified by someone else in the value chain and, raising some prospects for misuse. So I think, I don't want to comment on whether that is a good or a bad thing, but I don't think you can just call it simplification. And I think that kind of explains why a lot of the proposal is being quite carefully scrutinized by the co-legislators. I mean, I do think that the EU regulation can be more risk tolerant, but if you were looking for this to be kind of just quick fixes, I think it does go beyond that. And, I think that raises some interesting questions. So, for example, by using this quick fix approach, the Commission hasn't done an impact assessment or done the usual processes it would go through with prior consultation in a formal way and thinking about what the different options are. And I think, some of the solutions that it's proposed that it kind of thought would be obvious potentially have some bad effects or might not be the most optimal way of fixing a problem. And the way that they've progressed means that, it's only after they've published something that the kind of the consequences of it are being fully thought out. So, I mean, if you were a pessimist, I think you'd say that this is the worst of both worlds, because on the one hand, the changes are very narrow, and it's not clear to me that they're really going to be that growth enhancing. But on the other hand, it's still being controversial, and some of these changes might slow down the package. quite significantly. And if it was just limited to simplification, it would potentially be easier. So I think in my mind, I think maybe the Commission could have taken a bit more of a strategic approach rather than what we see here, which is just a piecemeal set of options, which are partly simplification, partly deregulation. But very interesting to hear what other people on the panel think.
Yeah, well, thank you, Zach. I think we'll go back to sort of high-level questions towards the end. I think now I'd like to go some specific aspects of this omnibus to illustrate, in fact, what you're just talking about, and people can make up their own mind. And so what we're going to cover is topics to which we responded to the European Commission consultation. In fact, in the chat, you have the links to the two responses that the SCM Europe TPC provided, if you're curious. And so I want to start with something that I think everybody is familiar with, which is called cookie fatigue. The fact that, thanks to GDPR, every time we go on the website, we have this game of clicking the right buttons in the cookie banners. And obviously, the observation of how people deal with that is that oftentimes they don't pay attention when they click the thing that gets the thing away the fastest. And so maybe Stephanie, can you tell us a bit more what are the proposed changes and the expected outcomes and your take on it?
Thanks. Okay, so I've picked out the three main changes that I find interesting. One is the one-click cookie rejection for all non-essential cookies. The second is a back-off period, where if you've rejected cookies, they can't ask you again for another 6 months. Hopefully that'll help with the fatigue. And finally, it's the technical solution where a human doesn't need to communicate their own cookie preferences anymore. Your browser or your device will do it for you. So with the one-click cookie rejection, I think this would be welcomed by users, so that you're not having to go in, maybe deselect multiple different cookie trackers. But it does raise a question to me about business models, and are businesses going to adapt to this if more people are able to easily reject cookies? Are they going to change to a different sort of tracking, maybe device fingerprinting, browser fingerprinting? Is tackling this with cookies the real issue, or do we need to think broader about tracking, both for businesses and for users? And my second take was on the back off period, because as I said before, I'm from an engineering background, so I'm all about implementation. And I immediately thought, how would you do that? And as a web developer, you sort of go, I would put a cookie on the browser so that I know in 6 months' time I can ask again. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what implementation will actually come out and what will become most popular, because people won't want to hold more data within the database about users. So yeah, is it going to lead to more cookies? Could that fulfill the mandatory requirements? Because obviously the user can delete them. So I think there'll be an interesting time ahead there. And my favorite one is the technical solution to, understand what users really want with their data management and cookie policies. But in reading it, there's currently no mention of any standardization of this technology. So are we at risk of going back to the old days of where when you're coding for a website, you have to know which browser people are using, what kind of communication is that going to use for the cookie preferences? As an engineer, you sort of immediately think an HTTP header, but again, will that be standardized across browsers? So yeah, but I think a really appealing aspect of the sort of integrated cookie preferences is as a parent using it as parental controls, maybe for schools, organizations that have a lot of computers. I think things like that would really help them.
And so is it a case where it's a good intention, but poor implementation?
I think the implementation's to be decided, isn't it? And I think it's going to be led by what the key browsers do.
And are you aware of the key browsers makers trying to sort of come up with an interoperable solution, or
And not a
it's not
modern
on the
one.
table?
Yeah, I think as far as, I mean, there's also the do not track that we had
Yes.
from a long time ago, which never really took off because it wasn't mandatory. So it'll
Yeah.
be interesting to see if they just stick with that sort of solution or if they're going to be pushed to do something else.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So, by the way, for anybody on the webinar here, if you want to ask questions or just put comments, please do it in the Q&A section box rather than the chat, because this way people can upvote and downvote, and it's easier for us to keep an eye on them. I don't know if any of the panelists wanted to add something to this cookie fatigue issue. One of the things that drives me crazy is the legitimate interest. I never understood why a zillion companies would have a legitimate interest in me navigating a particular website. And I didn't see that being sort of changed in any way. I'm assuming there's pressure from companies to keep having this right. So am I right that this is not going to change?
It doesn't look like it will change, because the definition of legitimate interest is one of those areas that's hard to really quantify, isn't it? I
Yeah.
think Ahmed has a point of view.
Yes, a remark
Ahmed, please.
here, maybe a
Yeah.
recommendation or a thought. As in my old life, I used to work as a search engineer, and a big part of how the business model is set up about using and understanding your users better and selling more services to them. And as long as the business models that we live in try to sell time and the eyes of the users, it would be very hard to depart from this model, and the interest for or the legitimate interest to know more the users and make sure that every single chance to get to know the user better is not lost. This will stay as is. So I believe that there is a need for a shift of the business models to look at different ways of how they could monetize the chances, and at the same time preserve the privacy and not be in a Hunger Games mode for knowing more about the users. And for that to happen, there needs to be a change in the business model, change in the technologies, and also a preservation of the fundamental rights of citizens. It's very important to protect that.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a perfect transition to my next question, which will go to Masiej about personal data, one of the fundamental rights that was sort of addressed by GDPR. And we saw in the Omnibus a particularly drastic change in the definition of personal data. Zach mentioned it briefly. And so, Masiej, you can maybe tell us a bit more about this, and also about the fact that the Council of Europe, which is not the Commission, the Council of Europe has announced that they will actually delete this change. But is this really going to happen, and is this going to be enough? So what's happening with personal data in this omnibus?
So thank you very much for that question, because I think if there is something controversial in Omnibus, this is one of the most controversial aspects that there were implemented there. As Zach has mentioned, basically this envisage a complete rework of the definition of personal data. Personal data would whether some information would be quantified as a personal data would depend solely on the holder's ability to re-identify the individual. And this is basically called a subjective or relative approach to personal data. And as many people have alarmed, this would basically rework the whole structure of the GDPR, because if there are two concepts that the GDPR is founded upon. It's either the concept of consent, so the cookies that we discussed before, and the concept of personal data. The European Commission actually claimed that this was in response of the latest judgment of the Court of Justice, claiming that this is just a simple codification. However, the European Data Protection Board was not on board with that, and basically they opposed that direction throughout, I think, the whole 2025. And as we know, the European Commission is backing down on that, and also I think that generally we are returning to the normal, I would say, previous definition of personal data. But I would say that it has drawn a lot of criticism, and it is justified as I think this would give opportunity to basically omit the provisions of the GDPR in many cases. But it also opens a very interesting question that some scholars have raised. And more precisely, in the age of AI, whether the GDPR era definition of personal data is still relevant. Because if we look back at 2016, the GDPR, I would say the jewel in the crown of the European Commission at that time, it was based on a very simple, quantification of risks that are associated with privacy. It was still time when basically privacy was seen as keeping information about a certain data subject and related rights to either accessing that information, modifying that information, or maybe deleting that information from standard classical databases. In the age of AI, in the age of large language models, when we know quite well that personal information can be embedded into them, the European Commissions and generally the legislator across the globe, because it's not only the European Commission, are struggling more and more towards defining personal data in such a way that is still meaningful under our more and more digitalized and more automatized environment. And I think this is a guess, but this is a guess shared also by some scholars when we are trying to survey the literature on that topic, that basically European Commission has tried to change the definition of personal data, not only to relax the legislative landscape, but also to make the personal data still applicable in an age when basically we collect so much data and that data is embedded into structures as large language models that we are not always are able to tell whether some company is holding or not personal data, that the GDPR era definition of personal data is more and more problematic. And this was also the Court of Justice observational matter. However, I think that this change, and I'm not alone in that judgment, that this change was quite ill-posed, to say that diplomatically. The basically subjective interpretation of personal data just on the capabilities of the holder of the personal data opens the doors to many, let's say, compliance misalignments, especially that the data subjects cannot control what means of identification or re-identification the given holder really has. So really, many people, including European Data Protection Board, argued that this change would completely nullify the whole regime of the GDPR. I am quite in favor of that opinion, but I think that the larger problem remains, even right now, when we are backing up to the old definition of the personal data. So the European Commission is accepting that the change was ill-posed and ill-timed. It's still the problem that we have to question ourselves: is the GDPR definition of personal data still relevant in our cases?
Yeah, and I think I think you're right that and in fact, my understanding is that this redefinition of personal data was mostly or only targeted at using this data for training AI models. Uh, and so are we suggesting that maybe there should be different definitions of personal data depending on what you're going to use it for? I mean, uh, also the notion of what personal data you're collecting and for what use is part of the GDPR, and maybe we could do something a bit more subtle than the big axe that they put in Omnibus. I don't know if Zach, you had, since you mentioned it in your opening statement, if you had a comment on this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I am sympathetic to the view that like it really does substantially change the scope of GDPR and as I said at the start, imposes risks. I mean, I do think it's not just around whether the definition works, but also whether the obligations that attach to personal data in GDPR are still applicable in an AI world. So, for example, this concept of explainability, I think, is very difficult to apply to AI models because, I mean, the whole point of them is that it may not always be easy to precisely track how and where a particular outcome has been reached. They are inherently a bit of a black box, even if they can to some degree show a chain of reasoning. And secondly, this idea about the right to be forgotten is fascinating because does that mean that an AI model has to be completely retrained if it has included a piece of personal data, regardless of the likelihood of that personal data becoming part of the outputs of the model? So I think these are all really, really difficult questions. I definitely don't have the answer to them, but I think there is, I think, a need to revisit the GDPR. I think as I said at the start, I think the Omnibus proposal and the Omnibus method of assuming that this is a kind of a straightforward change that doesn't need a lot of thought and debate is probably not correct.
Okay, thank you. And since we started mentioning AI, which is always the elephant in the room, so there are a number of things relative to AI. We're not going to cover all of them. One of them is, I think, something that speaks to a lot of people, which is the notion of watermarking or labeling AI-generated content for various purposes, including trying to mitigate disinformation and other things. So Ahmed, can you tell us if this, well, what is this about in more detail, maybe, and whether these provisions are adequate and addressing the
Sure.
problem effectively?
Sure. Let's start first by doing a very compact definition of watermarking. So watermarking is mainly adding traceable signals or information or labels inside digital context that helps to identify where this comes from. If we look at the Omnibus, it has clearly mentioned in Article 111 that it is necessary that the generative AI providers, they ensure two things, that the content that is AI generated is watermarked, so marking them and having them detectable. And it has put kind of a deadline for that, which is February 2027. If we look at what the Omnibus has asked for, I believe that this is a great start here. But again, as Stephanie mentioned in her case, it is not clear the implementation of that. It has not actually classified the different types of data, the multimodality here, so the text, the videos, and the photos. If we look at the domain, we will see that there is quite good advancements when we look at watermarking both for the videos and for the photos. But the watermarking for text is pretty challenging, especially when it comes to, for example, paraphrasing it or summarizing it or any other technique to change the style, for example. It makes it very challenging to put watermarks in text. So if we were to think about whether this is a good step or not, yes, this is a great step to put it. But what is necessary to do is what happens after February 2027. There is not a very clear guidance of how to implement these interoperable standards. And I'm afraid if this stays like that, this will open a door for ambiguity for uh, uh, operators or companies or SMEs to meet these requirements. So it is also very important, in my opinion, that there is also a form of a machine readable provenance. So it is not just depending on the human eye to do that, but there is also a need to automate the process in order to be able to process a volume of information or data in the multimodality. It might not be with the same effectiveness from text to photos to videos, but it is also necessary to acknowledge the limitation in that. And it may be to help the industry to grow and focus on specific standards that could help make this happen. If we look at the international landscape for standards, we can look at C2PA. So that is one important provenance ecosystem that I believe it is very necessary for Europe to connect and interface with it, even if it's inside Europe, might not be the only de facto that is used for watermarking, but missing the international dynamic or ecosystem that might result in making Europe isolated when it comes to changing information. Also, it would limit the ability of the European ecosystem to detect watermarks and have a standardized operating scheme. So if I were to think about the article, the 111 that brought up watermarking, I think it's a very good step, but it is necessary to get a little bit in the details of guiding the SMEs and the different organization of how to implement watermarking in an effective manner. Maybe until February 2027, Europe would have a bit of time to figure out that, but beyond this date, it is necessary to come up with clear, concrete steps to implement the watermarking scheme.
Yeah, thank you. So actually, there's a question in the Q&A from Philippe saying, watermarking requires the collaboration of the people generating the data. If the goal is to protect against misinformation, is it likely to work? I can imagine that actors wanting to disseminate disinformation will just not watermark their content. So I guess the question is, how do you detect that something was AI generated and not watermarked, and what are the what's the punishment?
That is very important aspect, especially if you look at the abuse of the information, be it text or image or fraud. So it is important that Europe directs also some energy to deal with the cases of fraud of data and IP, and also the misuse of AI generated material. So this is very good remark, because there is some form of an assumption in the article that you have a collaborative producer, but what if the producer would like to hide their identity to exploit the system as much as possible? So that is very important to focus on enforcement on deceptive use cases.
Thank you. I think we're going to move to another topic, unless someone wants to react to the topic here. But maybe let's move on. So another aspect that is maybe less visible from the general public is about incident reporting. And we know in the in the digital community that it's important to report incidents so that the problems can be fixed in a timely manner, and given the amount of cyber attacks for one thing, but other problems that may occur due to AI technology, among others, this issue of incident reporting becomes quite important. So I'm going to go back to you, Stephanie, about this. Can you tell us what is why is this important? What are the proposed changes and their possible impacts?
Sure. So, incident reporting, why is it so important? I think that one of the key things to remember is that reporting helps limit damage to individuals and their personal data. It can prevent damage to national services, infrastructure, and then aside from that, it can be used to help build a picture of wider attacks. As soon as the reports start coming in, you could see maybe that there was several of the same type of attack across different countries. Um, it also is great for learning. We need to know when there's a new type of exploit, um, who else could that affect? Can we get the word out? And the other, probably the one that probably happens the most might be accidental leaks. So this is comes to GDPR, where it's not a nefarious actor. It's just that settings weren't done right, or maybe there's a bug in software and everybody that runs that is at risk of this. So the incident reporting is really important. It's more important for some services than others, but anything that handles personal data needs to have a robust reporting procedure in place. So within Europe, there are different agencies for different types of reporting. And within the Omnibus, they've proposed to have a single entry point that so you can report your incident and it can go to every agency that needs to know about it. So the implementation of that, as my engineering mind picked up on, is that one of the key things they've said is that they want the single entry point to not hold data, to not process data, which immediately made me think, how are you getting data in? How are you deciding where it goes, and what format are you sending it in? As every country has its own data protection authority. So if you have a GDPR issue and your website controllers in Spain, it needs to go to the Spanish authority. So they're going to have one entry point that can communicate with multiple agencies. So to me, that sounds complex, to say the least, unless they go for quite a static sort of data format. Like I think it's also because they're talking about simplifying templates, and at this point, it becomes I think the question is how can you simplify across 5 or 6 different agencies, all of the different templates they need? How do you make sure the right data is going to the right agency with minimal processing? There's also the concerns around the data handling, how they're going to segregate it, how the incident can be prioritized. If this isn't happening in the entry point, is this all happening just as it is today? Are we really simplifying the system, or are we simplifying it just for the end users? Because I know a lot of people would welcome the end user simplification, but we actually don't use it that much because hopefully we're not having, huge security issues weekly. It's something that you do rarely. So I think it is great that they've got the one entry point, so you don't have to scrap around trying to find which agency you need to contact. But I think there will be questions around the implementation.
Thank you. I don't know how many of you wanted to also address this point.
Just a few additions. I think, Stefan, you have covered the core points in a fantastic manner. I would like to say that the incident reporting is a pretty important requirement that the Omnibus is bringing forward. And incident reporting, although it requires organizations to report formally to regulators AI failure, and this might look like it's a lot of pressure on organizations, but also this presents a great moment for collective institutional learning. And it should be framed as a way where the organizations and the governments would also earn more public trust. So it's not a bad thing in itself. However, also I would propose here, when it comes to incident reporting, few changes to how it was presented in the omnibus, especially, for example, to include progressive reporting, where there could be an initial type of report, and when there is more information that is based on yeah, investigations, then they should be released and accepted in a standardized manner. Also, reporting will help have some form of a defensive mechanism against vulnerabilities in the system. So it's a very welcome requirement, in my opinion, though it's necessary also to make sure that there is a level of automation and also there is a level of evolution in the timeline of the incident. So it should not be a one-timer thing. It could happen depending on the investigation also.
Thank you. And so I think in some way related to that, there's also, I suspect in the name, maybe not so much of, well, a simplification, especially for SMEs, for some small and medium enterprises, a number of adjustment to various thresholds, some related to well, declaring different levels of incidents, if I understand correctly, others about levels of risk. And so, you know, it's important to have thresholds and to strike a balance between the level of risk and the competitiveness in the global world. And so I'm going to go back to you, message about this issue of some examples of what is in the omnibus on this aspect of changing thresholds and the impact it may have.
So also thank you very much for that question because I think it's the question that is core of the digital omnibus. If omnibus aimed to do something, it aimed to lessen the administrative burden, to make to protect the fundamental rights, but also to make our European companies competitive once again. Because if there was one topic on the policy of and technology on the brink of those two areas in the European Commission is digital independence. And it's quite fresh approach because even 3 years ago, when basically we were dealing with DSA, DMA, DGA, we were still living in Brussels effect era. And there was an assumption that once the regulations are passed, basically the various lawmakers across the globe will adjust to that. However, right now, the Commission is a little bit reassessing that approach, and this is directly reflected on the level of omnibus. When there are, in general, we could say that we could use a taxonomy of two different types of thresholds. One connected to the subjects, so how big is basically the company that is operating the system, that is deploying the system. And those are based on the revenue or size of the company. And then there are, I would say, topic subjects that are also directly connected to the deployment of the system, whether it's high risk or whether it's not high risk. And there's a lot of things that I could say here, but I think that if it comes back to SMEs, we could have basically a discussion on the proportionality because we already knew that the compliance burden is placed on especially SMEs that they usually don't come with large compliance departments is negatively impacting the competitiveness. However, there's a big question. If we relax some provisions of, for example, AI Act in relation to SMEs, is it really beneficial for the protection also of fundamental rights? Because when we are thinking about that, if individual is impacted in a certain way by an autonomous system, then from the perspective of harm, it's very, I would say, it's very unlikely that they will care whether the harm was caused by deployment from large company or from SME. On the other side, I think there's also a question on that in Q&A, and it's a very nice example actually of how the administrative burden of the new wave of post-GDPR regulations is impacting the efficiency and deployment of those systems in quite, I would say, reasonable circumstances. So I think, and this is also my question to other panelists, what they think about it. But I think this is maybe the only thing that Omnibus do quite right, and it's not disputed that much. The various thresholds placed both on depending on the size of the subject, and then depending on the risk of the system. And I generally think that this is one of the key contributions of Omnibus that will stay with us. And we will see that more and more from the European Commission in the upcoming months or years. But also, it's not without some controversies, as I said. Basically, if we relax the level of protection, there is a question whether really the competitiveness of the European, let's say, technological environment is really a good pretext for relaxing the uh, fundamental rights protection.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody wants to add something. Yeah, go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with Marcia, but I think there are some changes for SMEs and in particular for smaller and medium, small mid-cap companies that benefit now from some of the exemptions for SMEs that are purely around administrative requirements like documentation and reporting, which I think are kind of fairly sensible. My question would be, why not extend those to everyone? Because if we don't think they're necessary for small, then and what we want in Europe is for our companies to be able to grow into larger firms. Then I'm not sure why that tiered approach really makes sense. And then I think there's this question around if we're taking a risk-based approach, does that justify smaller companies being exempt? And I think the point was made quite well that in some cases it might if a small company does pose less risk, but as we see with AI companies, for example, you don't necessarily need to be that big to have a really big impact on kind of systemic risk in or in reach in terms of number of customers. So I think maybe a tiered approach makes sense, but maybe size of firm isn't the right criterion. And then again, I think if what we are focused on is a rights-based approach rather than a risk-based approach, then this idea about tiering doesn't really seem to make sense to me. And look, I don't have the answers, but I think maybe what we need is a more clear discussion about what exactly it is that we're trying to achieve with these laws so that we have a better sense about when a tiered approach makes sense or doesn't make sense. But I think at the moment, particularly when it comes to kind of AI and data, on the one hand, policymakers, they want a data economy, they want an AI economy, and that means making data easier to share and lowering the burdens to doing that. But then on the other hand, we also want a really high level of rights protection. And there is just a necessary trade-off between those two things, and we have to grapple with that honestly and kind of with the evidence rather than just pretending that these two things can go along in parallel and never come into conflict.
Thank you. Before we get to the last question, given that we're close to the time, and I wanted to give time to answer the questions from the audience as well. There's only one question at the moment. From Andreas. I'm not going to read the entire question, but Andreas is saying I'm a professor for software engineering in Germany, and my innovation in teaching are actually blocked by having educational AI applications classified as high risk, which I perceive only stringent. So he's mentioning that he has a class with 800 students, and using AI to help grade is, of course, a great help compared to taking the time of a bunch of PhD students. And I can certainly, as a teacher, emphasize with that. And so how is the, is there anything in the Omnibus that would address this? You could look at this as a threshold, maybe some AI application to education are more acceptable than others. And does any of you have a take on this?
I mean, I can jump in. I don't think there is anything, at least not that I can recall in the Omnibus, that really addresses that situation. I think the real problem is that some of the categories of high risk use cases in the AI Act are simply just too broad, and they don't take the context in which an AI system is actually being used fully into account. Because, a lot of these high risk cases are actually ones that have either a lot of benefit in terms of competitiveness and economic growth, or they might even have benefits to kind of rights protection in some cases too. So I think the problem is one that is probably has to get resolved through a more political process, like through this digital fitness check that I mentioned at the start. But I don't think there's anything in the omnibus that helps in this particular case. So sorry.
Well, I just posted the link to the definition of high risk in education in the AI Act, and actually, I'm not sure that the situation that Andres is talking about is necessarily falling under that limitation, because it says, and item B in particular, it's AI systems intended to be used to evaluate learning outcomes, including when those outcomes are used to steer the learning process, etc. I don't know if you give an assignment, and I think it would be an interesting discussion of because there's a lot of use of AI in education at the moment, right? And so it cannot be the case that everything falls under this high risk classification. At the same time, I feel quite strongly that it's good that some aspect of education are under this level of risk. So as usual, it's a question of interpretation and how things will be going will be sort of implemented in a sense. So before we get to the other questions, and the high level question I had now that we've looked at some more specific aspect was what do you think about the Omnibus actually addressing the current challenges of trying to combine better European sovereignty and the protection of fundamental rights and also competitiveness? Is there at least some good stuff in there? Because of course we focus a bit on things we want to critique, but it's also maybe good to think if there is other positive things. And I don't know who wants to take the floor on this. Let me know. I think Ahmed and Messiej and Zach, you wanted to say a few words.
I can comment on that. This is the part of it. I believe that the omnibus is a very good step towards improving fundamental rights and competitiveness, but it does not show the whole roadmap for that. So this is a good milestone there. It provides a simplification, but sometimes it also could provide a way where the accountability could become less transparent. So it's very important when it comes to the requirements for reporting that it's clear and it's not used as an exit door from being accountable to the services and the products that are sold to the European citizens in the European market. I believe when it comes to sovereignty, it has not excluded it, but it has not provided a very concrete way of how this could be done in domains that are high risk, for example, like telecommunication or nuclear. It's a little bit clear what are the requirements, but in the broader market for digital services, it has not, in my opinion, laid down the important roadmap that when it comes to implementing. So it's a great step, but there is still a lot yet to come.
Okay. Well, just looking at the clock, there was a question that message you wanted to answer, a question from Philippe. Will relaxing rules around AI really benefit the EU economy when most big actors are non-European? Won't the latter be even more advantaged? That's been a big discussion. How do we? And I think GDPR, showed that more regulation was not necessarily an impediment to better competitiveness in a sense, but is that going to work for AI?
Yes, it's actually a very good question, and there are two aspects of it. Firstly, whether, as you said, basically the fundamental question, whether regulations really decrease competitiveness. Because pre-GDPR, there was a narrative that all the regulations hurt, basically the competitiveness of the local economy. On the other hand, what we saw and what was then basically taken as an assumption is that once the regulations were in and the actors were trying to be compliant with them, it increased the level of protection, but it didn't impact the economy in a meaningful way. The big question is whether this assumption that worked in case of the GDPR is basically applicable to all other regulations. And I think with the new wave, with the DMA, DGA, AI Act, there are more regulations and combined with sector-specific regulations, because we must remember that those are just general regulations. And for example, for medical devices, medical IoT devices, there will be many applicable sector regulations. Created such a mass that even the proposers of more strict approach to regulations, they basically agreed that maybe this is too much. Maybe we are pressing our economy down in such a way that they are more interested in doing bureaucratic labor than creating innovative solutions. The question is, right now, if we don't have that strong tech sector in Europe, as for example in the United States and China, whether the justification of the digital omnibus that we relaxed the compliance requirements because we want our companies to be more competitive, is really applicable. And I think that we are once again going back to various thresholds, and I fully agree with Zach that basically there is a very strange distinction on the, for example, visible on the level of digital omnibus. SMEs, medium cap companies, and then the rest. And the question is, if there's some possibility for relax the compliance requirements for the SMEs, for example, if there are some exceptions that allow them to at least defer some obligations, is it not the logical step forward to just basically remove those obligations altogether? Because from the perspective of protection of fundamental rights and systematic risks, it's a very strange move to put obligation on some companies depending only on their size, especially when we are dealing with products that can be deployed by a small team and cause quite great harm irrespective of the revenue generated by that company. So this is actually a very good question, and I'm sorry that I don't have answer to that because I think no one has answer to that so far. But
yeah,
basically, I think this is the root cause of that distinction between SMEs and medium size and all the others. Like the European Commission acknowledges that relaxing the requirements will not foster our economy precisely. But on the other hand, it is tied by regulatory rules and competition rules that basically we have to treat all the companies the same. So there is a little bit of smoke screen there. But the question is, who will benefit from that relaxed regulations? I think, I don't know, we will see.
okay.
Hopefully, it will also be European companies, but it depends whether someone is optimistic or not.
Yeah. Well, we're a bit over time. I would like to give Stephanie and Zach time for a few closing comments if you want.
I mean, maybe I can just add one point here, which is, I mean, one problem with the omnibus approach is it's not revisiting the whole digital key as a whole, but even individual files. It's, tweaking individual parts or definitions or provisions. And I think a big problem with the impact of regulation on competitiveness in Europe isn't about the standards that it's asking firms to reach, but about the design of the laws and the fact that in a lot of cases they are extremely prescriptive and they're not kind of future-proofed, which is why we're seeing these problems with, how AI applies to GDPR for example, or sorry, how GDPR applies to AI. And I think, to think about that, we need to go back to like principles-based laws, just the fundamentals of what good lawmaking is about, which is, keep your obligations targeted at the risk, give firms as much freedom to find the most efficient way to deliver the regulatory outcomes that you want, talk about outcomes rather than processes. And I think a risk is that the omnibus kind of approach kind of locks in the laws in the shape that we have them now, rather than thinking a bit more ambitiously about how you get rules that can stand the test of time. Because, I think what we want in Europe are laws that, you look at the US and policy environment is very febrile and unpredictable. The benefit that we have in Europe is in having kind of high standards, but at least you know what you have to play with, and we reward firms that are able to build a business model around protecting, data rather than trying to kind of undermine fundamental rights. And so I think this, thinking a bit more about regulatory design rather than thinking about do we need to lower standards might be a way of thinking about the relationship between regulation and competitiveness that isn't quite as polemic as some of this discussion has turned out to be in Brussels. So yeah, that's the final point I'd maybe like to leave on.
Thank you. Stephanie, you want to say a word?
Yeah, I think for me, a positive of the digital omnibus is that the way it's been sort of structured is for speed. And it's, they don't want to go back to the beginning, rewrite GDPR from the start, but that innovation is being supported. And this is maybe just a interstage, and something bigger will come out of it, bigger changes that keep Europe competitive and innovative.
Thank you. We had one last comment that came in the Q&A. It's more a comment than a question, but it's from Slava. It's frustrating and disappointing that technology regulation is increasingly restrictive, diminishing the spirit of collaboration and progress. And I will let you read the rest of the comment. I'm afraid we won't have time to address your comments, Slava. I'm sorry. I want to thank all the panelists for joining this panel and answering all these questions on so many different topics. I want to to thank also the attendees. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the ACM website if you want to watch it again or recommend it to colleagues. I also want to thank Jan Timonovsky, who's been sitting in the back, making sure the technology works, and it works perfectly. So thank you, Jan. And thank you, Tom, also for overseeing the webinar. If you are interested in the ACM's technology policy activities, please go to the website. If you do ACM, there's several ACMs, so don't go into the what is the other one? The Association for Country Music. We're not the Association for Country Music, but if you do ACM Technology Policy Europe, you'll find our webpage, and we're always welcoming new members for our subcommittees. The only requirement is to be an ACM member, but that's a good thing in any case to be. So thank you again. I don't know if Tom, you want to close the webinar for us.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, Michelle, for moderating this. And I'm dropping a link to our website, so go ahead and check it out if you're interested.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day.